Okay, next we have a panel discussion entitled The United Nations and Counterterrorism, Examining 20 Years of Security Council Engagement and Impact. Within days of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the UN Security Council took swift and decisive action to develop a robust international legal and policy framework. 20 years on, it is crucial to consider the impact of these efforts on security, international cooperation, humanitarian action, and human rights, and what aspects will be critical to ensuring that the UN and the Security Council can respond effectively to future challenges posed by terrorism and violent extremism. We look forward to this discussion, and I will hand it off to our moderator, Mr. Mark Power, Deputy Ambassador, British Embassy, Israel, United Kingdom Foreign Office.
Turn this on. There we are. Turn this on. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. And in case anyone wonders whether I'm an interloper on this panel, I've spent a quarter of those 20 years leading the UK missions team on counterterrorism and other things at the UN. So I'm not a sort of quite as random, but a moderator exactly. But first, before we start, I wanted to just welcome some very familiar faces and a new one. But I'll start with Eric Rosand, who's worked on Security Council counterterrorism for a long time, both inside and outside US government. Irfan Saeed, who's an acting deputy CT coordinator in the US government in the State Department, coordinating all of the CT activity, and again, someone who has been operating and working in the counterterrorism, multilateral and international space for some time. And Majed Al-Ansari, who comes from the Qatar Institute for Strategic Studies here. Welcome very much, and we're very grateful and very interested to hear about the regional perspective you're adding to this issue. And perhaps, if I may, I wondered, actually, Majed, if we might start there and ask you to talk to us about what you feel. Any conversation about terrorism, we like to start with by sort of defining the threat and understanding where the threat is. And I wonder if we might turn to you from a region which suffers greatly from terrorism to talk to us a little bit about how you see the threat, both here in the region and beyond. And then we can kind of go back onto the ways in which the Security Council has responded to that threat and dealt with it over the last 20 years. But first, let's hear from you on the current picture.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Usually, post-lunch sessions are very difficult to attend and difficult to participate in. So hopefully, we are able to captivate the audience.
The key to this is going to be starting a debate, so I'm going to get you all to disagree at some point.
Well, the ever-evolving challenge of terrorism begins with definition and ends with the drivers behind radicalization. And I think it's very important for us to identify that the whole spectrum of issues relating to terrorism has been evolving very rapidly in the past 10 to 20 years. We have seen it move from quasi-centralized threats, more localized threats, to international cyber, post-network terrorism, which we are seeing now advancing more and more in the world. We've seen the threat move geographically from one place to another, from Central Asia being the host of most of the terrorist threats, the viable terrorist threats we were dealing with in the 90s and the beginning of 2000s, to Syria and Iraq post-2010, and now to Africa. We are seeing a move of a lot of the terrorist elements to Africa, and terrorist funding also happening within Africa. And now, of course, with the situation in Afghanistan, the big question is, are we going to see a resurgence of the same of what was happening before 2000 in this part of the world. Also, the technological advances have changed the face of terrorism threat internationally. We've seen terrorists move from the need to recruit in a similar way to security agencies, where you have to cultivate a relationship, identify the candidates, open the discussion through the narrative, and then move to active recruitment. What we are seeing right now is that recruitment can happen literally in some studies that's been done in 15 minutes to 20 minutes, which is quite a different landscape than was happening before. And now the need for network-based operations has almost diminished. Orders don't need to be sent very clearly. General directives are enough for sleeper cells, for individuals, sympathetic individuals to become human bombs walking around streets in Europe and other parts of the world. And in this part of the world, I think there's a new driver, or not a new driver, but a more pressing driver of radicalization and terrorism, which is the failure of the state. Surprisingly now, if you take the 22 Arab countries, almost half of these countries can be characterized by some definition as either failed or fragile states. The state has literally diminished in this part of the world. It is being rolled back as a concept internationally. And therefore, I think what we are facing now is a more complex threat when it comes to terrorism, but also it cannot be contained to one shape or measure. And I'll stop it there. I think I took enough time from the panel.
And no, thank you. And I mean, and as we look and turn to the council, Eric, I mean, council very much the very rapid action that we saw in 2001 was in direct response to Al-Qaeda. That's what the foundation of lots of the council architecture on countering terrorism was directed at. It has evolved and moved over time. But as Majed says, the threat is both dispersing and proliferating, but also increasingly in ungoverned spaces, which is a challenge for the United Nations as an organization of states. How well equipped do you think the Council is at the moment to respond to this threat picture, and to what extent is that derived from successes or failures of the past?
Well, thank you. I think you have to start by rewinding and looking at sort of where the Council has tried to have an impact in terms of counterterrorism since 9/11. And the first area is on norms, basically creating this global framework, legally binding in many cases, to get countries to take legal and operational action against terrorism directed at national governments, right? So it's a set of binding obligations directed towards national governments. The second was on capacity building, recognizing that many of these governments didn't have the capacity to implement their obligations. The Council really started energizing the whole global community around building the capacity, the capabilities of national government institutions. And then the third was on coordination. It was getting more countries to work together at a practitioner level or at a, whether it's military, intelligence, operational, law enforcement, et cetera. But again, national governments. So the focus for the last 20 years of the Council, in part because of the way the Council operates, it works with governments and is run by national governments essentially, has been on the national government level. And I think what you're seeing today is that despite this very robust architecture that the Council has inspired at the national level, the threats are very local. The threats are not necessarily directly linked to terrorism, but are part of a much larger, complex threat environment and geopolitical environment. And there, I think the Council's ability to work with civil society, to work with cities, to work with communities is limited. And other parts of the UN are much better equipped to do that. And secondly, the Council's development and nurturing of its counterterrorism mandate, which is a very, very strong mandate that is very popular in the Council because there's it's one of the few issues in the Council that has consensus among the permanent members. So if you want to take a topic to the Council that's going to get consensus among the permanent members, counterterrorism is usually it. And so I will just end with a rhetorical question, which I know will be considered at a later stage in this panel, which is, given the era we are now in where strategic competition is a dominant theme, will the desire to have P5 consensus matter anymore? And if not, what would that mean for the counterterrorism agenda in the Council, which was largely driven in part by the fact that the P5 were trying to agree with each other on that agenda?
Yeah, I mean, the title of this, as I was, one of the things, as you say, that we get onto is the title of this conference is about great power competition, and we've had many, my 5 years on the Council, many disputes over many things, but very few differences of opinion seriously on the CT agenda in the Council. But we have had differences of opinion on the CT agenda in the UN, but the Council's view of that has been relatively the Council has been relatively insulated from that. I mean, Irfan, you've been doing a lot of work on sort of the new administration's refresh to the CT strategy. I mean, talk us a little bit through that. I know it's not all about the Council, but talk us through some of it, and also comment, if you will, on the sort of division of labour between the General Assembly and the Council. Because as Eric said as well, there are some aspects of this which are not best addressed through the Council. The Council's particular mandate and powers.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Mark. And before I start, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the Soufan Center as well for convening this great gathering the last couple of days, and of course, one more day in this time of a pandemic, actually bringing us all together. They deserve, I think, great kudos, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel with all of you guys in particular. Earlier, I think when Bobby was on and we were talking about some of the other things related to like vaccines, there was this idea of this outbreak of diplomacy and the importance of multilateralism. And I think this panel highlights that, this importance of multilateralism. And when you talk about terrorism, and as Eric said, it's one of the areas in counterterrorism where I think you will find better chances of agreement. And so when you have this outbreak of diplomacy on something that we can all agree on, it behooves us to find that way forward. And when you talk about what we can do in this space and what the Council, what the United Nations writ large should be doing in this space, I think it's that idea of ensuring that that outbreak of diplomacy continues and that the multilateralism that needs to happen grows. And you asked about this administration's policy, so let me address that very quickly. The Biden-Harris administration came in very quickly, and from the secretary to the vice president, the president said very clearly, we are back. Multilateralism is going to be at the fore of any strategy, any engagement that we do. Bilateralism obviously is an important part of our conversation, but we know and understand that working through the United Nations in particular, we can achieve our goals. Specific to counterterrorism, I take Eric's point about the capacity building and the norms and the cooperation that must exist. At the State Department, we've done a lot on the capacity building in particular. But he's right. All terrorism is local, and all counterterrorism is also local. So what we've tried to do using this idea of we're back in the multilateral space is to build off the work that the UN is doing. And we commend the creation of the UN Office of Counterterrorism, and we look at some of the work that they're doing on capacity building, going more local. So there are a lot more opportunities that I think we all have, both through the UN and outside the UN. And I'm happy to talk about that down the road. You talked about division of labor, and I think that's an important one too, because again, as Eric noted, and I'll always say that I think throughout the course of this panel, because Eric's the #1 expert on this issue, so Eric, great to be right behind you on this. But when you talk about the capacity to build these norms, there's lesser capacity to actually build that relationship at a very local level where it's most needed. And that, I think, is what we're going to be trying to do in the next 2 to 3 years in particular.
But, I mean, do you see, so when I was in New York, I mean, I was always very clear in my mind about the sort of the different bits of the UN's contribution to the question, as it were. You've got we heard from Edmund Fitton Brown yesterday. He's the chair of the 1267 monitoring panel. They're basically the threat analysts. They sit there and they agree the common shared threat. You've got CTED, who, their strongest powers are around monitoring of the council set standards for nations' counterterrorism responses and structures. And CTED, are the experts on both advising on, capacity building part, how to strengthen them and to meet the council standard, but also going and checking that they have actually been met and that things are working properly. Right. And then finally OCT, which, for many years, we certainly felt in the UK, well, Eric and I worked a lot on this to sort of, around ideas around creating the Office of Counterterrorism and you as well, to get the UN better at that local angle, being able to work more effectively. I mean, do you feel that overall, from the United States point of view, the system is growing and adapting and getting better, both at understanding each constituent parts, understanding their roles and value add, but also kind of getting better at the implementation?
So I'll answer that in the most diplomatic way I can. I think the answer is yes, and to be seen.
Yeah.
Yes, in terms of understanding the need to have different actors at the table, all the different parts of the UN. And you mentioned a lot of good parts of the UN, but we also work very closely with UNDP, UNODC, and others on a variety of efforts that are tangential to the CT fight. So yes, in terms of, good that we're seeing growth, but it's still to be seen how all of these parts will work together and can work together. And I think that's where we've got some work to do.
And Eric, I'm going to come to Majed in a minute to ask him how all this feels when you're not a council member, but in a region affected. But Eric, I wanted to come to you first because I feel like you might speak a bit more plainly than Irfan, if I might be so bold. But I thought also, on this point of effectiveness, the UN can proliferate a lot of structures. Sometimes some people would say the US government is quite good at proliferating structures and things, and that maybe the UN slightly reflects its host nation in that regard. But I mean, you mentioned OCT, UNOCT, and other agencies, UNDP. I mean, have we cracked this nut about too many people doing too many different things? We used to tear our hair out about it a little bit when we were thinking about what could replace OCT. How well do you think it's really going?
I'll answer that in a second. I think this gets to your point that the UN reflects perhaps the vision of its host government. And I would argue that the proliferation not only of counterterrorism institutions at the UN, but of counterterrorism institutions around the world, the reason why the Security Council, its CTC and CTED, focus so much on the development of counterterrorism-specific institutions, architecture, capacities in every single country is because, in large part, that's what the United States was advocating for after 9/11. So this very myopic, often high priority on counterterrorism has trickled down both in bilateral context but also multilaterally. You're left with today, 20 years after 9/11, this behemoth, this counterterrorism superstructure that exists not only in Washington but in the UN system and in many of your capitals. And so the challenge now is, how do you right that big ship to deal with the current threat environment, which is very different from when the ship was built and launched. And I think the challenge, of course, is that moving any battleship, even just a little, requires a lot of energy and attention and resources. And so I think that's the challenge. For OCT specifically, I think it's basically Pac-Man, the game Pac-Man. It's going up and eating every little thing around the world in terms of counterterrorism, international counterterrorism bodies and partners, and it's just sort of making them link up to OCT, so OCT becomes the center of the world in terms of international counterterrorism capacity building. It receives 6% of its budget from the regular budget. So 94% of its budget comes from different countries. It doesn't reflect, therefore, the fact that OCT is so big doesn't reflect the fact that member states want it to be so big. It reflects the fact that certain member states support it, which is wonderful, but it's not a universally supported issue. If it were, it would be a much smaller thing, and I would argue that's where it has to get to. It has to be a much smaller entity that's just doing coordination and not doing all this implementation work. There are 42 other parts of the UN system that are on the ground doing implementation work, capacity building, and OCT should really be just the coordination mechanism to facilitate all of that, rather than entering itself into that space and ultimately duplicating a lot of what these other actors already do. A perfect example is that on any hot issue that the UN is dealing with when it comes to counterterrorism, return of foreign fighters and their family members from Iraq and Syria is the latest. Multiple different parts of the UN are producing guides, recommendations, manuals, they have training programs, and it's just an obvious duplication. They'll say it's not, they'll say it's all coordinated, but to the end user, it seems like you're drinking out of a fire hose sometimes when it comes to UN counterterrorism products.
Yes, and by the way, actually, it was on the issue of foreign terrorist fighters, interestingly enough, since we're at the Soufan Center conference, Richard Barrett did an excellent, piece of work kicking all of that off under UN auspices, and that work stream has grown. So there's a bit of evidence of impact. But Majed, is this all sort of exotic and ephemeral when you're sat in the region, hearing the sort of turf battles of UN headquarters in New York? I mean, there was always a school of thought when I kind of was in New York, when I spoke to UK domestic counterterrorism bodies. They'd be like, what really is the UN doing on counterterrorism? Counterterrorism is about sort of interdicting terrorists, banging doors down, sort of sorting things out properly. We've got police agencies, prosecutors, and internationally kind of capacity building work. Where's the UN really playing a role? And I think as I was saying before, there is a clear articulation to that. But do you feel that here? And do you think countries in the region, to what extent do you feel they're valuing and seeing leadership from the UN on this agenda?
Well, let me start with this anecdote. I remember I was in a meeting at the UN headquarters in New York, and it was with the OCT, and in the room were one person for each initiative under the OCT. And I remember thinking there are probably more initiatives to countering terrorism than there are terrorist groups around the world. You could have seen this clearly with the number of people, inside the room, outside the room, waiting to get in. But to be serious a bit, I think that the OCT is doing a good job when it comes to initiatives and widening the scope of the initiative. You have to remember that the UN is moving sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly from CT to countering violent extremism, CVE, to PVE, preventing violent extremism, and each one entails a wider scope, a different way of addressing the issues. I think one main issue here is, as Eric was saying, it's at the end, it's a bureaucratic nightmare to maneuver between the member states, the affected countries, the partners in the field, the NGOs, the different war zone contexts, and to try to find some ways to working towards preventing violent extremism mainly, and preventing the drivers behind radicalization, which is a very difficult thing to do. At the end, the UN is, of course, under a lot of pressure from member states. It is an organization of states at the end. Whatever the UN is doing is not a UN product. It's the product of compromise and politics between the member states, and therefore whatever comes out of the UN is usually this collection of wills, if you will, from different countries and different political entities, and even NGOs that are affecting the process. There's a general feeling of liberal agenda being pushed through the UN because member states, especially Western member states, are pushing for this kind of agenda when it comes to peace building and when it comes to counterterrorism programs. The narrative is a very Western liberal narrative when it comes to countering terrorism. There's very little impact of local context on the idea of countering terrorism. I think Qatar kind of changed this a little bit by being one of the main funders of the OCT. in the past couple of years by even establishing the International Hub on Behavioral Insights in Countering Terrorism, and we have the team here in the room. And I think this introduction of Qatar as a player, and Qatar has played the role of mediation in Afghanistan and is involved in the Afghan issue, it gives a way for member states from the global south, especially, to be present in the OCT format, not only as members and funders and staff, but also as effective relays of what's happening in the field. One other issue I think that relates to the UN's work when it comes to counterterrorism is defining what terrorism is, what violent extremism is. So we know that since Ban Ki-moon was General Secretary and the plan of action, there was an attempt at defining first terrorism, and that didn't happen, of course. I think the session is still open in the Security Council.
It has the potential to be as much of an industry as the disarmament industry in the UN in terms of rolling on as a process, yeah. I think is a...
And then, of course, we got into defining what violent extremism is, and then defining what preventing violent extremism is. And there are a wider scope. I think even in one of the documents the UN published, it basically said that the difference between violent extremism and terrorism is that it includes a wider array of threats, and therefore making the problem definition and norms even more complicated. And this is especially important to our part of the world, to be honest, because the idea of defining terrorism has affected a lot how counter-terrorism was used and abused in this part of the world. It was used to invade countries. It was used to crush dissent in some countries. It was used to even roll back human rights and political rights in a lot of countries. And therefore, it is very important not to reach a definition, but at least, and I think one of the good things that happened in the Security Council was defining the characteristics of the terrorist or the violent extremist, and therefore getting at least some criteria into what or who we are combating in this field.
Eric, you wanted to?
Yeah, because on the definition point, I think it's an interesting one if you look at the sort of the last 20 years, because I was working in the Security Council right after 9/11, and also in the General Assembly where they were negotiating the convention, the legal convention where the definition was being debated. And in the Security Council, we're like, we don't need a definition. It's just we can't be slowed down by the definition. We need states to take action against terrorists within their borders, and the focus was on Al-Qaeda, and everyone knows who Al-Qaeda is, and so just go after that. And we don't have time to wait for a definition. Meanwhile, it was the OIC countries which were adamant about a definition, trying to negotiate a definition. And at the time, I was sympathetic to the Western position. 20 years later, you see that the lack of a definition has actually allowed abuse of the UN Security Council and wider UN CT framework by authoritarian governments, by repressive governments who aren't taken to the mat for overly broad definitions of terrorism. They're not taken to the mat for applying terrorism measures against political opponents, against female drivers, against journalists, against you name it, because A, there's no definition, and then the Security Council has agreed to focus on capacity building and not on compliance.
But Eric, just if we had defined it narrowly and carefully and specifically, would it not have been the case that we would have then really struggled to change it when the scope of the threat changed? Because, I mean, we've had to, in the UK, change elements of the definition of terrorism in the Terrorism Act, which requires Act of Parliament, fine. But like in the UN, as you know, once something is set in stone, it's really difficult to change it. And so I feel like there's a sort of counter-argument to that, which is if we'd managed to do it, would we not have created a rod which would have then prevented us from doing all sorts of other things and adapting to the threat in a dynamic way?
I mean, that's definitely a line of argument. I don't think that was ever used as a reason not to pursue a definition. I think the reason at the time was that it was this debate between freedom fighters versus terrorists is well known, hasn't gone away, and the politicization of the use of terrorism was of concern, of terrorism measures was a concern, and it still is. So I don't think you can ever agree on a definition in the UN context. And this gets to another point. I'll let Irfan jump in. I know he's eager to, which is
fulminating.
There are so many different perspectives at the UN, at the member state level, on how best to deal with terrorism. The notion that there's consensus is, I think, there's consensus on a very low floor.
Yeah.
Or a low ceiling, but it all breaks down when you start talking about specific cases. It all breaks down when you start talking about specific countries. So yes, you can get agreement on a piece of paper in New York that is kind of watered down to satisfy different member states' interests, but when it comes to actually operationalizing that, it's virtually impossible because the divides between these countries are getting bigger and bigger and bigger as more countries are facing the threat within their borders.
Irfan.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in with a different take on this and sort of talk about the sort of rosy picture of what the UN has been able to accomplish in the last 20 years, in particular on the counterterrorism side, obviously taking into account the difficulties in getting definitions passed and getting language that is, amenable to everyone. But what they have been able to accomplish, again, 20 years since 9/11 is somewhat extraordinary if you think about it, but it's also allowed us to shift focus as needed. And I think this goes to your point about how definitions could change over time, actors can change over time, and drivers obviously change over time. And what the UN has been able to do is allow us to shift focus where we needed to go when those changes are happening. So just from a couple of years ago, and it's amazing to me how now the conversations that we're having are very different and so far different from the conversations we were having in 2016 and 2017, when we had this rise of individuals from places around the world, young kids leaving their homes, very comfortable lives, and joining the fight in northeast Syria and Iraq. And what the UN was able to do was sort of look at this phenomenon and figure out how to turn it on its head, how to counter it. And working through this new PCVE plan of action, which was important, working through the promotion of civil society and different actors in this space. And again, to the point where we need to go more local, bringing in that idea of going local and not having just these multilateral organizations as the end-all, do-all. But again, fast forward now, 4 years on, and things have changed exponentially, and we are in a very different space. We're not necessarily talking about individuals who went over. And again, I didn't even talk about UN Security Council Resolution 2396, where we all came together to come up with an UNSCR that allowed us to shift focus on stemming that tide. But here we are now, 4 or 5 years later, and the focus now is on repatriation. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the importance of bringing people out of those camps, out of custody, where they are in northeast Syria and Iraq, and bringing them back home. And it's a difficult conversation, and we know it's a very difficult conversation. But this is where we commend the UN for taking on this difficult conversation. And this conversation carries more weight when the UN brings the conversation to the fore, rather than just 1 or 2 countries. In addition, it's part of a conversation we've had over the course of today and yesterday, which is the rise of racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, or REMV, as we call it in the United States. I know it's called so many different things around the world, but when we're trying to counter this new, I don't want to say new threat, but this metastasizing threat of countering REMV, again, it's the United Nations that is having this conversation, is bringing the rest of us into the conversation to ensure that we are looking at a solution in an ideologically blind way. And I think before we didn't really do that so much, but now I think we have to when we talk about how to counter REMV.
And I mean, as we were saying yesterday on the other panel that I was on, multilateral spaces are a place for engagement. I mean, the fact that you can't agree doesn't mean that the conversation wasn't worth having, because you have a better understanding of each other's position.
No, absolutely. I think the issue, what you're describing, Irfan, is what multilateral organizations do.
Right.
They are a space for convening, for dialogue, for diplomacy, for trying to reach consensus on different issues. The challenge comes when the UN tries to operationalize a lot of this stuff and sees itself as a dominant or predominant actor in the field on all these issues, and it's doing programs, it's doing workshops, it's doing training. It may be overstepping what its comparative advantages are, and I'm speaking mostly for the Security Council now, not the wider UN, going beyond what its true comparative advantages are. And I think that's, for me, is the issue, is 20 years after 9/11, what the comparative advantages for a body like the Security Council in dealing with counterterrorism are going to be very different than they were in September 2001, because so much has changed in terms of both the threat, but in particular, the architecture, which is so robust, so dynamic, in part because of the successes of the Security Council. So now I think it has to take a step back and think, look at the Security Council, what is its most appropriate role on these issues going forward? And I can't believe it's to continue to churn out new mandates, new counterterrorism resolutions every year on some issue or another that then task different parts of the UN to do more project activity, more reporting from member states, when they haven't even ever assessed the impact of all the resolutions that have been adopted up to now and all the impact that the reports that have been generated up to now have had.
Can I just jump in here before? Okay. I think it's very important also to discuss the change in paradigm that's happening by leaving the war on terror mentality. As it's
Leaving
happening, the war on terror paradigm, if you will. I mean, the panic-based policy making that happened post 9/11 has shaped most of the past 20 years when it comes to countering terrorism. But slowly we're leaving that paradigm. More focus is being put on PVE. At the same time, the change that's happening within the terrorist groups themselves, within the terrorist threat itself, the introduction of terrorist threats that are not coming from the same classic sources that we are used to and we know how to talk about. And although we try to deal with terrorism blindly, there's a general consensus that it comes from the global south. What is happening, what we are seeing now with what happened in New Zealand, with new threats happening in Western countries, is that now we are facing we need an actual blind way of dealing with violent extremism. We are seeing radicalization happening in Western context, not of Muslim youth, but of white, Anglo-Saxon, prosperous individuals who are in the far right and who are becoming very quickly radical and militant. And therefore, the idea now is to find a new paradigm other than the war of terror, the concept of that the states are fighting a non-state actor that is targeting the states. We are now working against an enemy that does not have a shape or color that we can identify, demonize, put on screens, and turn our guns towards. We're talking about the threat of an idea that can jump from a Facebook page to a group that is not the usual, vulnerable to radicalization individual. It is somebody who's living in a prosperous, democratic, liberal setting, who is not of a different ideological background to the society in general. They have good connections within society on a network base. Now we're talking about this and we are thinking, that is preventing violent extremism now different? Are we talking now about a different, rather than state to non-state actor, we are talking about within a global society idea of what radicalization is, how it happens, and the economic, educational, cultural aspects that affect how we think about radicalization and how much we are willing to take our opinions and move them into violence, even within settings that do not have the usual drivers of this kind of violence.
Yeah.
If I can jump on that real quick, I take your point wholeheartedly, but the challenge is, when we talk about this battle of ideas, it's no longer a fair fight, if you will, because the battle of ideas is now being waged with misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah,
and part of this role of, again, shifting focus is how do we shift to this new era of challenging the misinformation and disinformation that perpetuates with social media platforms online, and how do we engage with some of those social media companies in a way that still protects the fundamental freedoms of freedom of speech and expression?
Well, I want to use the rest of our time to talk about two things, actually. So one, and it's to pick up on your point, Eric, about the future, and something you mentioned, Majed, about Western, the predominance of the Western sort of mindset in the UN institutions. I mean, we've got all these challenges. We're entering a period, or we're in a period of global competition, which is the theme of this conference and has been woven through lots of the discussions that we've had. I mean, it's axiomatic. The Council, as an organ, has always agreed less resolutions, done less work when the main permanent members have been more divided. and we're in that space now, and yet we have these, threats that are not new but are growing in seriousness, including how we deal with online harms, radicalization online, the rest of it. It's not a new concept, but it's with the proliferation of the threat and the proliferation of platforms, it seems to be getting worse and worse, and we still aren't really seeing either governments at a national level, let alone at an intergovernmental level, dealing with it. So I suppose maybe I'll come to you, Irfan, on this, because you are sat representing a national government. How are you thinking, firstly, about how you keep the consensus as much as possible as you can on these issues in the council so you can move forward, but also how you actually do some things? Because I can remember trying to convene a conference on online harms with the tech companies and for an UNGA one year that Theresa May and Macron wanted to host, and it was an absolute nightmare. And I don't think it's got any easier. How are you thinking about tackling those, and how do you think you can also get actors like Russia and China on board, let alone also, our friends here in the region who are also saying, hang on a minute, your approach doesn't quite work for us either?
Yeah, I think that's the big challenge now we face, and it's an excellent question. It's a two-pronged process, and it's the same process we always follow, but we know that trying to figure it out in this particular realm is more difficult. The first one is understanding the threat. And that's where we always start with our baseline, is what's the baseline of what we're trying to counter? And right now, we're still in the, I don't want to say information gathering space, but that's exactly where we are, because we don't know how far and wide the misinformation, the disinformation is proliferating online, and then how it metastasizes offline. So that's the first thing. We have to get, yeah, go ahead.
And just a quick clean-up in there, because, it's been the rest of the world, some of the rest of the world's viewpoint, or it has been a viewpoint that the US government has been a bit protective of tech because it has so much of it there. And you're in the information gathering phase now. There are some parts of the world that would say, how much more evidence do you need?
Look, I'm not going to get into specifically our engagement with social media companies. I can tell you that our policy is and will continue to be engaging on a voluntarily basis. We want to have good collaboration, voluntary collaboration. We're in no way, shape, or form protecting social media companies. We do hold their feet to the fire as much as we can. I think we can say with a straight face that we've seen a lot of movement over the last 4 to 5 years, when we all know in 2016, 2017, where you could see some of these horrific videos that were talked about yesterday. You can see them on Facebook, you can see them on YouTube, and it was at just a click of a button, you had access to it. That's not necessarily the case anymore at the present clip, at the clip that it was. Obviously, there's always cases of some type of information still online, but when we engage with social media companies and we're hearing them out, they're telling us about their algorithms, they're telling us about their capacity to get better. The issue is not necessarily them. The issue is them getting the other companies more involved in this fight, because it's not just about the Facebook, Microsoft, Google, or Twitter. It's about the secondary platforms and the tertiary platforms that are being misused by terrorists and violent extremists to radicalize, recruit, mobilize, and inspire. And a lot of them don't have the same capabilities as Facebook, Microsoft, Google, and Twitter, or the desire to communicate with governments. So it behooves all of us to get them into the conversation. And this is where we talk about this role of multilateralism. I will talk about the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, GIFCT, and I believe Nick Rasmussen is speaking later today. And so, kudos to them for the work that they're doing in bringing in some of the secondary platforms. I'll talk about the Christchurch Call to Action. Just recently, the United States signed on to the Christchurch Call to Action, and there are a lot of steps that are being taken, a lot of steps that need to be done, in fairness. So they're not perfect, but the continued conversations we have, not only through bilateral and government-to-government cooperation, but also government to GIFCT, and then further down the road to the implementers.
Eric, yeah.
Yeah, if I can just jump in there.
The voice of frankness.
No, I think the issue for me is, what role should the Security Council play on this particular issue?
Yep.
And I think this is a classic case where a little bit of restraint is in order. Just because there's an issue of global concern does not mean the Security Council, and it relates to terrorism, does not mean the Security Council needs to take action. And I think The risk here is if you try to get the Security Council to take action, because of the composition of the P5, whatever output that it's going to be generated is going to be less than adequate from a number of perspectives, and implementation will be challenging. Monitoring implementation will be challenging, and it's going to create, I think, more complications than it will solve any problems. This is why there's been a proliferation outside the UN of a lot of different bodies over the last 10, 15 years, including GIFCT, including the Global Counterterrorism Forum, in recognition of the fact that, you know, in some cases, the Security Council is not going to be best suited to take on a problem. So that's the first point. The second point is...
But just sorry, on that though, does that mean, if we agree that this is one of the single biggest issues facing terrorism, does this mean that, are we admitting that the Council's action in that, is there a problem with that, I suppose, admitting that the Council's action
well, the Council
is limited, an ability to act is limited?
Well, I don't think it even comes close to the Council's inaction in Syria, because the division in the P5. Well, I mean, I think you could, on so many big issues,
right, so
the Council is...
So we're putting in the box of things on which the Council is blocked
because of polarization. Because of the misuse of counterterrorism measures by certain Council members, P5 members, I think it's a very dangerous path to go down. And I think there are other ways to do this multilaterally. The second point is, given that we're talking about hybrid threats, I'm not sure it makes sense to talk about it through a counterterrorism lens. Right? It's disinformation, hate, polarization, and extremism all blend together. You can look at it through a variety of lenses, and I think it's a mistake to consider it only as a counterterrorism issue. And this gets to but the UN only looks at single issues. It has an inability, because of its silo nature, to look at cross-cutting issues really. So it's what box do you put it in? And similarly, this is a multi-stakeholder issue, right? It's private sector, public sector, government, civil society. And again, the UN is not, particularly the Security Council, is not well-versed and suited to be a multi-stakeholder platform, nor a hybrid threat platform. This gets to the issue of, is something needed for the next 20 years that is, whether part of the UN or not, a much more dynamic space where hybrid threats can be considered, where multi-stakeholder collaboration is the core of it, not sort of every so often you invite civil society for a speech. But that's the future of multilateralism, is something that is multi-stakeholder in nature and multidimensional in its focus.
Well, I mean, I was involved in some discussions with colleagues from NATO recently about the challenge for hybrid threats and the amount of work that they're doing to try and grapple with and to define that. I mean, Majed sat from outside, does it feel like New York and the Council needs to try and find a way past this stovepiping of issues and come up with a doctrine or a concept around dealing with hybrid threats? Although, you know, post-it note, two members of the Council, certainly one of them quite likes the use of hybrid threats to its advantage, so maybe that's too much to ask.
Well, you know, as we all said, at the end it's a bureaucratic behemoth. It's the collective will of the member states. But if I can, borrow something Irfan was talking about, the idea of misinformation, disinformation was always a driver of radicalization before the internet, right? The idea is that the medium changed and the scope has changed. So the medium of disinformation used to be governmental, in some rogue states, governmental media, or some aspect of classical traditional media, or even, mosques or other venues. Right now it's the internet. And the internet used to be, first of all, a way of terrorists to contact each other and then to recruit. And now it's a way for governments even, to corrupt the discussion on social media and to send out messages and to radicalize in different countries, and for non-state actors to do the same where they are. And I think one of the main problems here is that, for obvious reasons, authoritarian governments are better at withholding information from their people. While now, as the governance of the internet is happening in democratic settings, this means it makes it very much difficult to control the disinformation and misinformation that will go through the internet and will result in, intentionally or unintentionally, in radicalization. The internationalization of the governance of the internet is even a more complex issue, and it could result in even more problems, as other members of the Security Council and other members of the UN who are less inclined for freedom of speech can be part of that process itself. So it's it's a bit of a quagmire here. How are we going to make sure that the international sphere of discussion and talk within societies and across societies does not result in this kind of radicalization through the manipulation of societies and manipulation of segments of societies through misinformation and disinformation, and at the same time make sure that freedom of speech and basic human rights are respected across the internet, which is a global phenomenon. What we are seeing right now, I think, is a bit of a panic in Western governments on how to deal with this issue. And there isn't, I think, a real understanding in this part of the world, or a need in this part of the world, to address this problem in the same manner. One of the main reasons, of course, if there's a problem with the internet, you can, shut it off at any moment when needed. But another part is that the problem is being exacerbated now in Western societies more than it is in this part of the world. Misinformation, disinformation is a reality in this part of the world. People are used to it and know how to deal with it, right? Regardless of believing it or not. But there's a general mechanism within society on how to deal with it. What it results in more basic democratic societies is it could be a change of government at any point according to this misinformation, disinformation, like we have seen in unnamed superpowers in the past 5 or 6 years. So what I think is needed now is the reverse. We need more focus in Western countries and in the Western world on how to deal with this issue. And that will affect how radicalization happens even in this part of the world.
So if I can jump in on that, I think one of the things you said is absolutely important is panic from governments on how to deal with this threat. I think that's exactly right. And bringing it back to sort of the UN discussion, this is where I think we do need some guidance. We do need a role that the UN and Security Council can play, because of this panic, there are so many disparate ways that governments are dealing with this problem. Some in a very large way. In the UK with the online harms, they're bringing a lot of different things into the pot. Whereas in the United States, we're focusing specifically on misinformation and disinformation. I mean, to Eric's point a little bit, looking at it from the counterterrorism lens, obviously you articulated that that's not necessarily the best lens, but for us, it's not an over-encompassing way of looking at one particular threat and trying to include so many different things. I think it's yet to be seen, and we're looking very forward to how the UK online harms and the paper and the existing legislation comes out and how it's implemented. I think that will be very important on sort of reining in some of the panic of other governments. We can't have an approach that is so far out of the realm and all over the place. There needs to be a consistent approach, because how we all deal with the internet and how governments deal with the internet can also shape how violent extremists continue to radicalize and recruit. By shutting access to the internet or different parts of the internet, we've seen through research is a driver of radicalization in and of itself. So we want to ensure that the solution, is not worse than the problem itself.
And I mean, can I just ask a question I'm genuinely interested in? It's like, and sometimes when I've been speaking to social media organizations about this, I sense that they are concerned about the issue. They don't want to be, they've got reputations to manage, but they also have ethical considerations. They don't, and a lot of them are very sincere about their mission and purpose of democratizing and spreading information and allowing freedom and access to it and connecting people. But when it comes to the sort of harms question, and the thing that, as you mentioned, we're trying to address in the UK to some extent, there isn't actually that much sort of theoretical thinking around, or at least they seem to be struggling a little bit with the theoretical thinking around where they should draw lines and boundary and concepts of radicalization and abuse and all of those sort of basket of issues. I mean, do you get that sense as well? And is there something, I mean, to go back to the purpose of the discussion, is there something that governments, that the UN, international organizations can help with? I know that they don't like to be lectured by us, but at the same time, it does strike me that there's a sort of a disconnect there. They've got lots of resources, lots of people, and I think some will to address the issue. But the sort of strategic concept of what they're addressing and what their red lines are in terms of doing it seem to be very ill-defined.
Yeah. I'll answer your question very quickly. I know we're running out of time. I'll say that no company wants to be known as hosting known terrorist content,
course,
right?
yeah.
So when you say they're sincere, yes, we have seen that they are very sincere in trying to engage with all of us in a way that restricts access for designated terrorists, for hate speech and the like. I think the problem is something that we've talked about here today, is this idea of definitions and defining what we're trying to counter. And to the, sort of the UK problem with this in terms of online harms, how do you define online harms? And what are we trying to counter? Are we trying to counter every type of online harm from bullying, hate speech, and the like? Or are we trying to counter misinformation and disinformation that is basically a terrorist narrative that leads people down the road of radicalization to violence and recruitment? So that's something I think where the UN can really help the global community shape how we're responding, how we're thinking, and how we're defining the threat, so we can craft a very equal response to counter to that threat.
Yeah, just quickly, I think you run into the problem of doing this through the Security Council when you are trying to get China and Russia on side here, and the value of a framework in this context that has their blessing is, I wonder how valuable that would be. And I think the second point is, before one rushes to sort of look to the Council as the norm setter going forward on counterterrorism, I think it really begs looking at the impact of both the positive and the negative impact of its resolutions since 9/11.
Yep.
That's never been done. There's just this sort of foregone, sort of this assumption that more resolutions by the Security Council means better counterterrorism, and that's never been demonstrated at all. So I think that is an issue.
You could apply that to the Security Council more broadly. I mean, the solution to every crisis is always a Council resolution, right, whether or not the Council can do something useful or not.
Right, but there's no issue where other than counterterrorism, where the Security Council has adopted 40 resolutions in the last 10 years. Secondly, I think while the issues of misinformation, social media are critically important, there's a risk, I think, of, much like there was with the focus on ideology and religion back in the day,
yeah,
there's a risk that that social media companies become an easy target for everyone to sort of focus their counterterrorism, preventing violent extremism energies on, and you're still ignoring the underlying drivers, what's making young people, old people, middle-aged people susceptible to that narrative. And it's easier to focus on the narrative, easier to focus on the social media companies than focus on the lives and the government behavior that's often negatively impacting the lives and generating the grievances. And it's the failure to focus on those prevention aspects that I think, and we get distracted by the shiny toy,
yep,
and then we lose sight of the long-term prevention. And I think there's a real risk in doing that here if we're not careful.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Part of our approach, obviously looking at the internet is just one very small piece of it. The underlying drivers, the factors, the reason why people are drawn to those misinformation, disinformation tropes in the first place is what's important.
As we wrap up, I mean, you mentioned one just before, so mine is, I'm going to ask you your favorite, or your sort of, what would be, I'll start with you, Eric, because you're probably more familiar on it. Your most effective piece of UN Security Council action. For me, it's you mentioned the designation list, and I think the fact that we have a universally internationally agreed designation list, it's not every one that we would individually want on the list, but it's very powerful in terms of setting out one or two, who actually is the internationally agreed people who are unacceptable and are designated terrorists, and that's important. I think just about everyone in the world respects that, bar possibly the Taliban cabinet who have numbers on it. But what would it be for you? And I'll come round.
Your mic's off.
I think that's certainly one of them, but I think that's sort of it's sort of an issue, and it's so focused that it's not really fair to compare to anything else the Council does on counterterrorism, which is plagued by definitional questions, which the sanctions regime is not plagued by.
Yeah.
I actually think the most 1373 was, I think, if you look at what it did, was the most influential resolution probably in the history of the Security Council, and it certainly, generated a whole host of positive, although not ever quantifiable or not ever measured, but I think just anecdotally very positive results in terms of strengthening the global network, counterterrorism network and community, and allowing for all these other issues to become, creating a space for it on the multilateral agenda. Before 1373, before the CTC, there was nowhere in the multilateral system where you could have conversations around practical issues of terrorism and counterterrorism, and 1373 changed that.
Irfan?
Yeah, I think you've got my answer, but I've also talked about 2396 and having worked on that really in the middle of that firestorm when the kids were going over, disappearing from homes, showing up in Syria or places like Somalia where their families had no idea where they went, and have the global community come together to come up with a solution was something I had never seen before, so I'll hang my hat on that.
Very good. Majed?
Well, if I can just change the paradigm a little bit in the question itself, I think it's very important also to focus on something that's usually more effective, at least from my perspective, in the global south in general, but in the societies where this is needing. The capacity building, training initiatives that usually fly under the political radar within the UN, where people look at it as a way of making your country look good through donating to that initiative or the other. These initiatives are very important in relaying the message and the mission of the Security Council and the General Assembly, sometimes even more than the resolutions themselves and the legal aspect of the UN's work. So I think it's important to continue to support them and to try to depoliticize them as much as possible. I know that's what's said, but not necessarily what's done.
Great. Well, with running almost exactly to time, thank you so much for joining me on the panel. Of course, echoing others on the panel and thanking the Sufan Center and everyone here in Qatar. I know you're not from the Qatari government, but as a citizen of Qatar, very much for your hospitality here this week. And thanks very much, and looking forward to speaking with you, continuing to speak with you. Thanks.